Welcome to a story that will leave you speechless. What happens when forbidden love collides with the brutal reality of the antebellum South? Today, we're diving into a tale of passion, courage, and an unimaginable twist that changed everything. But before we begin this incredible journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss stories like this one. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields of Magnolia Grove Plantation like a shroud, concealing secrets that would soon shake the very foundations of the small Georgia community. It was the summer of 1858, and the oppressive heat seemed to mirror the tension that simmered beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful estate. Samuel Washington, a name given to him by his master, though his mother had whispered Kofi into his ear the night he was born, moved through the rows of cotton with practiced efficiency. At 22, his tall frame and intelligent eyes set him apart from the other enslaved workers, though he was careful never to let his literacy show. His grandmother had taught him to read in secret, using charcoal on bark, and this knowledge burned within him like a dangerous flame. The plantation house stood majestically on the hill, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun. Behind one of the second-floor windows, Isabella Whitmore pressed her face against the cool glass, watching the workers below. At 19, she possessed a beauty that was both delicate and fierce. Auburn hair that caught the light like fire, and green eyes that held depths her father would never understand. "Isabella, step away from that window this instant," commanded Constance Whitmore. Her mother, as she swept into the room with the rustle of silk skirts. "A lady does not gawk at the field hands." "I wasn't gawking, Mother. I was simply observing the morning," Isabella replied, though her cheeks flushed pink. Constance's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Your father has important guests arriving today. Senator Morrison and his son will be joining us for dinner. You will wear the blue dress and conduct yourself appropriately." Isabella nodded dutifully, but her gaze drifted back to the fields where Samuel worked. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet dignity he maintained even under the watchful eye of the overseer, that stirred something deep within her chest. Down in the fields, Samuel felt eyes upon him and glanced toward the house. For just a moment, his gaze met Isabella's through the window. Time seemed suspended, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, a recognition, a curiosity, a dangerous spark that neither could name. "Boy, keep your eyes on your work," barked Jeremiah Colt, the overseer, his voice cutting through the humid air like a whip. Samuel immediately lowered his head, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the intensity of that moment. That evening, as the Whitmore family entertained their guests in the grand dining room, Samuel served alongside the other house slaves. His hands remained steady as he poured wine and cleared plates, but his awareness was entirely focused on Isabella. She sat across the table, engaging in polite conversation about the weather and the upcoming harvest, but Samuel noticed how her fingers nervously traced the rim of her glass whenever their eyes accidentally met. "The cotton yield this year should be exceptional," declared Colonel Whitmore, Isabella's father, his voice booming with pride. "My methods have proven most effective in maintaining discipline and productivity." Senator Morrison nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Charles, your reputation for running a tight ship precedes you. Perhaps you could share some insights with my son here. Young Thomas will be inheriting our plantation soon." Thomas Morrison, a pale young man with soft hands and calculating eyes, leaned forward eagerly. "I'd be most grateful for any advice, sir. Managing property can be quite challenging." Samuel's jaw tightened at the word property, but he maintained his composure, continuing to serve in silence. Isabella noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders and felt a strange urge to defend him, though she couldn't understand why. "The key," Colonel Whitmore continued, "is to maintain absolute authority. Any sign of weakness, any hint of familiarity, and you'll have chaos on your hands. These people must know their place." "Wise words indeed," Thomas agreed, his gaze wandering to the servants moving around the room. "Though I must say, some of your staff seem quite well trained. That one there," he gestured toward Samuel, "carries himself almost like a gentleman." The comment hung in the air like a threat. Colonel Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel, who continued his duties without acknowledging the conversation. "Samuel has been with our family since birth," the colonel said slowly. "His mother was my father's property, and he's proven useful. But make no mistake, he knows his place." Isabella felt her stomach churn at her father's casual cruelty. She watched Samuel's face remain impassive, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible clench of his jaw. In that moment, she saw not property, but a man. A man with feelings, intelligence and dignity that her father refused to acknowledge. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, Isabella found herself unable to sleep. The conversation at dinner had disturbed her more than she cared to admit. She slipped from her room and made her way to the library, seeking solace in her books. The moonlight streaming through the tall windows provided just enough light to read by. She was so absorbed in her novel that she didn't hear the soft footsteps until a voice spoke quietly from the doorway. "Forgive me, miss. I didn't know anyone was here." Isabella looked up to find Samuel standing in the entrance, a stack of books in his hands. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from the impropriety of the situation and the thrill of it. I was just reading," she stammered, suddenly aware of how inappropriate it was for them to be alone together. Samuel hesitated, clearly torn between duty and something else. "I was returning these to the shelf. Master Whitmore had me organize his study today." "You can read?" The question escaped before Isabella could stop herself. Samuel's eyes met hers, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. "Yes, miss. My grandmother taught me long ago." The admission hung between them like a bridge, dangerous to cross, but impossible to ignore. Isabella had never met an enslaved person who could read, and the revelation shattered another piece of the world she thought she understood. "What were you reading?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel glanced at the books in his hands, then back at her. The risk he was taking by engaging in this conversation could cost him everything. But something about her genuine curiosity compelled him to answer. "Poetry, mostly. Shakespeare. Frederick Douglass, when I can find his work." Isabella's eyes widened. Frederick Douglass was a name whispered in scandalized tones among the ladies of her social circle, an escaped slave who had become a powerful voice for abolition. "You shouldn't be reading such thing," she said, but there was no condemnation in her voice, only concern. "If my father knew—" "He won't know," Samuel replied quietly, "just as he won't know about this conversation." They stood there in the moonlit library, two people from different worlds, bound by the dangerous secret they now shared. Isabella felt something shifting inside her, a crack in the foundation of everything she had been taught to believe. "I should go," Samuel said, though he made no move to leave. "Yes," Isabella agreed, though she too remained still. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. Finally, Samuel stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Isabella alone with her racing heart and a mind full of thoughts that would have horrified her parents. As she made her way back to her room, Isabella couldn't shake the image of Samuel's eyes, intelligent, proud, and achingly human. For the first time in her sheltered life, she began to question the world she had always accepted without thought. In his small cabin behind the main house, Samuel lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The brief conversation with Isabella had awakened something in him that he had tried to keep buried. Hope. It was a dangerous emotion for someone in his position, but as he replayed her words, her expression, the genuine curiosity in her voice, he couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, in this cruel world, there might be someone who could see him as more than property. Neither of them slept well that night, both haunted by the implications of their encounter and the knowledge that their lives had just become infinitely more complicated. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night in the library, and Isabella found herself creating excuses to walk past the fields where Samuel worked. She told herself it was merely curiosity, an intellectual interest in understanding the lives of those who worked her family's land. But deep down, she knew it was something far more dangerous. The opportunity for another private conversation came unexpectedly when Isabella's horse, Duchess, threw a shoe during her morning ride. She found herself stranded near the old oak tree that marked the boundary between the cotton fields and the pasture, struggling with the mare's bridle as storm clouds gathered overhead. "Miss Isabella, are you hurt?" She turned to find Samuel approaching, his face etched with genuine concern. He had been working on fence repairs nearby when he heard Duchess whinny in distress. "I'm fine, but Duchess has lost a shoe. I'm afraid I'll have to walk back," Isabella replied, acutely aware that they were alone and far from the watchful eyes of the house. Samuel examined the horse's hoof with practiced hands. "She can't make it back on 3 shoes, especially not with you riding. The ground's too rough." He looked up at the darkening sky. "And that storm's coming fast." As if summoned by his words, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within moments the sky opened up, releasing a torrential downpour that sent them both scrambling for shelter under the massive oak tree. Pressed against the trunk, with barely 2 feet between them, Isabella became intensely aware of Samuel's presence. Water dripped from his dark hair, and she could see the rise and fall of his chest as he caught his breath. This close, she noticed things she had never seen before. A small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes held flecks of gold, the strength in his hands that spoke of years of hard labor. "We should wait here until it passes," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral despite the intimacy of their situation. Isabella nodded, unable to trust her voice. The rain created a curtain around them, isolating them from the rest of the world. In this temporary sanctuary, the rigid rules of their society seemed as distant as the plantation house itself. "Samuel," she began hesitantly, "that night in the library, you mentioned Frederick Douglass. Have you read his autobiography?" Samuel's eyes searched her face, looking for signs of a trap. Finding only genuine interest, he nodded slowly. "Yes, miss. It opened my eyes to possibilities I had never imagined." "What kind of possibilities?" The question was innocent enough, but they both understood its deeper implications. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain cascade from the oak's branches. "The possibility that a man's worth isn't determined by the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth," he said finally. "The possibility that freedom isn't just a dream, but something that can be fought for and won." Isabella felt her breath catch. These were dangerous words, treasonous thoughts that could get Samuel killed and her family disgraced. Yet she found herself leaning closer, hungry for more. "Do you truly believe that all men are created equal?" Samuel's gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw a fire that both frightened and fascinated her. "I have to believe it, Miss Isabella. Without that belief, I'm not a man at all. I'm just what your father says I am, property." The word hung between them like a challenge. Isabella had never questioned the natural order of things, the hierarchy that placed her family at the top and people like Samuel at the bottom. But looking at him now, seeing the intelligence in his eyes, the dignity in his bearing, the pain he carried with such grace, She began to understand that the world she had accepted was built on a foundation of lies. "I've never thought about it that way," she admitted quietly. "I've never really thought about what it must be like for you." "Most people don't," Samuel replied without bitterness. "It's easier not to." The rain began to lighten, but neither of them moved to leave their shelter. Isabella found herself studying Samuel's profile as he watched the storm, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his wet shirt clung to his shoulders. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the humid air. "Samuel," she said softly, would you teach me about what you've read, what you've learned?" He turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Miss Isabella, that wouldn't be proper. If anyone found out—" "No one will find out," she said quickly. "We could meet in the old stable, the one my father doesn't use anymore. Just to talk, to learn." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, and Isabella could see the war raging behind his eyes. The rational part of him knew this was madness, that any association with her beyond his duties could cost him his life. But there was something else there too, a longing for connection, for someone who might see him as more than a slave. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you want to learn from someone like me?" Isabella considered the question, searching for words to explain feelings she barely understood herself. "Because," she said slowly, "I think you might be the first honest person I've ever met." The rain had stopped, but they remained under the oak tree, the air between them charged with possibility and danger. Samuel reached out slowly, his fingers barely brushing against Isabella's hand where it rested on the tree bark. The touch was electric, sending shock waves through both of them. "This is dangerous," he whispered. "I know," she replied, but she didn't pull her hand away. They stood there for another moment, hands almost touching, hearts racing with the knowledge that they had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Finally, Samuel stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should get you back to the house," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and I'll see about getting Duchess to the blacksmith." Isabella nodded, though every fibre of her being wanted to stay in this moment forever. As they walked back toward the plantation house, leading the limping horse between them, she felt as though she was returning to a world that no longer fit her properly. That evening, as Isabella sat through another tedious dinner with her parents and their guests, she found herself thinking about Samuel's words, about the books he had read, about the way his eyes had looked when he spoke of freedom. The conversation around the table about cotton prices and social events and the proper management of slaves seemed suddenly hollow and cruel. "Isabella, dear, you seem distracted tonight," her mother observed. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm fine, Mother, just tired from my ride this morning." Speaking of which," Colonel Whitmore interjected, "Jeremiah tells me you had some trouble with your horse. One of the field hands helped you, I believe." Isabella's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, Father. Samuel assisted me when Duchess threw a shoe. He was very helpful." "Good. It's important that they understand their duty to assist the family when needed." The Colonel's tone was casual, but Isabella caught the underlying message. Samuel had been performing his expected role, nothing more. Later that night, Isabella lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of her encounter with Samuel. She thought about his hands, so gentle with her frightened horse, and the way he had looked at her when she asked him to teach her. She thought about the brief touch of his fingers against hers, and the way her heart had raced. For the first time in her sheltered life, Isabella began to understand that she was falling in love, and that this love could destroy everything she had ever known. 2 days later, she found herself walking toward the old stable, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She had left a note hidden in the library, tucked inside a book of poetry she knew Samuel would find when he came to dust the shelves. The message was simple. Tomorrow, after evening prayers, the old stable. As she approached the weathered building, she saw a faint light flickering through the gaps in the wooden walls. Samuel was already there, waiting for her with a small oil lamp and a worn book in his hands. "You came," he said softly as she slipped through the door. "I said I would," Isabella replied, though her voice trembled slightly. They sat on opposite sides of an old hay bale, the lamp between them casting dancing shadows on the walls. Samuel opened the book, a collection of poems by Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman who had become a celebrated poet. "She wrote this," Samuel said, his voice filled with reverence, "while she was still in bondage. Listen to these words. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." Isabella listened, transfixed not just by the words but by the passion in Samuel's voice as he read them. Here was a man who had been denied education, denied recognition of his humanity, yet he spoke with more eloquence and feeling than any of the educated gentlemen she knew. "She's saying that skin color doesn't determine a person's worth," Isabella said slowly, beginning to understand. "Exactly. She's challenging everything your society believes about people like me." As the weeks passed, these secret meetings became the center of Isabella's existence. Samuel introduced her to the writings of abolitionists, to slave narratives that opened her eyes to horrors she had never imagined. But more than that, he shared his own thoughts, his dreams, his pain, and Isabella found herself sharing things she had never told another soul. Her loneliness, her doubts about the world she had been born into, her growing certainty that the life her parents had planned for her was a prison as surely as slavery was for Samuel. One evening, as autumn painted the Georgia landscape in shades of gold and crimson, their conversation turned personal. "What do you dream about?" Isabella asked as they sat closer together than usual, the October chill making them seek warmth. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I dream about being free," he said finally, "not just from slavery, but free to be myself, to speak my mind, to love whom I choose, to walk down a street without lowering my eyes." He looked at her then, his gaze intense. "What about you? What do you dream about?" Isabella felt her cheeks burn. "I dream about being brave enough to live according to my own heart instead of my father's expectations." "And what does your heart tell you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Isabella knew that her answer would change everything, that once the words were spoken, there would be no taking them back. "It tells me," she whispered, "that love doesn't recognize the boundaries that society tries to impose on it." Samuel's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with infinite tenderness. "Isabella," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I know it's impossible," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I know the world will never accept it, but I can't help how I feel." "Neither can I," Samuel admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "God help me, neither can I." When their lips finally met, it was with the desperate passion of two people who knew they were stealing something precious from a world determined to keep them apart. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, then deeper as months of suppressed longing finally found expression. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, both knowing that they had just sealed their fate. Whatever happened now, there would be no going back to the way things were before. "We have to be careful," Samuel said, though his arms remained around her. "I know," Isabella replied, though she made no move to leave his embrace. Outside the stable, the wind picked up, rattling the old wooden walls and reminding them both of how fragile their sanctuary really was. But for now, in this moment, they had found something that transcended the cruel boundaries of their world. They had found love. Winter settled over Magnolia Grove like a heavy blanket, and with it came a dangerous intimacy between Isabella and Samuel. Their secret meetings had evolved from intellectual discussions to stolen moments of tenderness that both knew could cost them everything. The old stable had become their sanctuary, a place where the rigid rules of antebellum society couldn't reach them. But secrets, like winter frost, have a way of revealing themselves in the harsh light of day. It was Martha, Isabella's personal maid and the daughter of the plantation's cook, who first noticed the changes. Martha had been born into slavery on the Whitmore plantation, just 2 years before Isabella, and the two had grown up together in the strange, complicated relationship between mistress and servant that the South demanded, close enough to share confidences, distant enough to maintain the illusion of hierarchy. "Miss Isabella," Martha said one February morning as she helped her mistress dress, "you've been different lately, happier but scared too, like you carrying some heavy secret." Isabella's hands stilled on the buttons of her dress. Martha's dark eyes were knowing, too knowing, and Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the windows. "I don't know what you mean, Martha," Isabella said carefully. Martha continued braiding Isabella's hair, her movements gentle, but her voice pointed. "I seen you walking toward the old stable at night. I seen the way you look at Samuel when he's serving at dinner, and I seen the way he looks back." Isabella's blood turned to ice. If Martha had noticed, who else might have seen? "Martha, I ain't gonna say nothing," Martha interrupted quietly. "But Miss Isabella, you playing with fire. And when that fire burns, it ain't just gonna burn you, it gonna burn him too, and probably burn him worse." The warning haunted Isabella throughout the day, but when evening came, she found herself walking toward the stable anyway, drawn by a force stronger than fear. Samuel was waiting for her, as he always was, but tonight something was different. There was a tension in his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes that made her stomach clench with dread. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Isabella nodded, settling beside him on their usual hay bale, but he didn't reach for her hand as he normally did. Instead, he stared at the flickering lamp flame, his jaw tight with some internal struggle. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about what we're doing, about where this can lead." "Samuel, no, let me finish." His voice was firm but not unkind. "I love you, Isabella. God help me. I love you more than I've ever loved anything in this world, but loving you is going to get us both killed." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "We've been careful. No one knows. Martha knows." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Samuel continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "She came to me today, warned me that others are starting to notice. Your father's been asking questions about why you've been taking so many evening walks. The overseer's been watching me more closely." Isabella's mind raced. "Martha won't say anything, she promised. It doesn't matter what Martha says or doesn't say. The truth has a way of coming out, especially when people are looking for it." Samuel finally turned to look at her, and Isabella saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. "We have to stop this, before it's too late." "No." The word came out fiercer than Isabella had intended. "I won't give you up, I can't." "You have to," Samuel said gently, "because if you don't, they'll kill me, and they'll make you watch." The brutal honesty of his words broke something inside Isabella. She knew he was right. She had grown up in this world, had seen what happened to slaves who were perceived as stepping out of line. But the thought of losing him, of returning to the empty, meaningless existence she had lived before, was unbearable. "Then we'll run away," she said desperately. "We'll go north, where we can be together." Samuel's expression was infinitely sad. "Isabella, look at me. Really look at me. I'm a slave. I have no papers, no money, no connections, and you're a white woman from one of the most prominent families in Georgia. Even if we could somehow make it north without being caught, what kind of life would we have? You'd be an outcast, cut off from everything you've ever known, and I'd still be a runaway slave." "I don't care about any of that," Isabella insisted, though even as she said it, she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "Maybe you don't care now, but you would eventually. And I couldn't bear to watch you come to regret choosing me." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of reality settling between them like a stone. Isabella knew that Samuel was right, that their love was doomed from the start. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. "So, what are you saying?" she asked finally. "That we just pretend this never happened?" "I'm saying we end it now while we still can. While we're both still alive." Isabella felt something break inside her chest, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't just stop loving you." "Neither can I," Samuel admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But sometimes love means letting go." Before Isabella could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps outside the stable. Both froze, their eyes wide with terror. Samuel quickly extinguished the lamp, plunging them into darkness just as the stable door creaked open. "I know someone's in here," came a voice that made Isabella's blood run cold. It was Jeremiah Colt, the overseer, and he sounded drunk and mean. "Come out now, and maybe I won't use my whip." In the darkness, Samuel's hand found Isabella's, squeezing it once before letting go. She understood the message. He was going to reveal himself to protect her. But before he could move, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She stood up and walked toward the door, stepping into the moonlight where Colt could see her. "Mr. Colt," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I was just looking for my cat. I thought I heard her in here." Colt's eyes narrowed as he studied her, clearly suspicious. "Your cat, Miss Isabella, at this time of night? She's been missing for days. I was worried about her." Colt stepped closer, and Isabella could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Funny thing is, I could have sworn I saw someone else come in here, someone darker." Isabella's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. I've been alone." For a moment, Colt seemed to consider whether to push the issue. Then his gaze shifted to something behind Isabella, and his expression changed to one of cruel satisfaction. "Well, well," he said slowly. "What do we have here?" Isabella turned to see Samuel emerging from the shadows, his hands raised in surrender. Her heart sank as she realized that her attempt to protect him had failed. "Just me, Mr. Colt," Samuel said quietly. "I was checking on the horses when I heard Miss Isabella call for her cat. I was trying to help her find it." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of dutiful behavior expected from a house slave. But Colt's eyes glittered with suspicion and something else. Opportunity. "How convenient," Colt drawled. "The two of you alone in a stable at night looking for a cat." He stepped closer to Samuel, his hand moving to the whip at his belt. "You know what I think, boy. I think you've been getting ideas above your station." "No, sir," Samuel replied, his voice carefully respectful. "I was just trying to help Miss Isabella." "Is that what you call it?" Colt's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been taking liberties with your betters." Isabella stepped forward, desperation making her bold. "Mr. Colt, you're mistaken. Samuel has done nothing wrong. He was simply— Miss Isabella, Colt interrupted, his tone suddenly oily and false. I think you should return to the house. This is a matter for men to handle. The dismissal was clear, but Isabella couldn't leave Samuel alone with Colt. She had seen what the overseer was capable of, had heard the screams from the slave quarters when he decided to make an example of someone. I won't leave until I'm satisfied that Samuel will be treated fairly, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. Colt's expression darkened. Miss Isabella, I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. This boy has been found in a compromising situation, and there will be consequences. What compromising situation? Isabella demanded. We were looking for my cat. Were you now? Colt's smile was ugly. Then you won't mind if I search this stable for evidence of other activities. Isabella's blood turned to ice as Colt began poking around the stable with his lantern. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. The books that Samuel had hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, the same books they had been reading together during their secret meetings. Well, well, Colt said, holding up a volume of Frederick Douglass's writings. What do we have here? Seems our boy Samuel has been doing some reading. Illegal reading. Samuel's face went pale, but he said nothing. They all knew that literacy among slaves was forbidden, punishable by severe beating or worse. And this, Colt continued, pulling out a small notebook, appears to be his own writing, love poems by the look of it. His eyes glittered with malicious glee as he read from the notebook. My heart belongs to one whose beauty shines like starlight, whose courage puts the bravest men to shame. Isabella felt the world spinning around her as Colt's words sank in. The notebook contained Samuel's private thoughts, his feelings for her laid bare in verse. In the wrong hands, it was evidence enough to condemn them both. Interesting reading material for a field hand, Colt said, his voice dripping with false concern. I think Colonel Whitmore will be very interested to see this. Please, Isabella said, her voice breaking. Those books, they're mine. I left them here by mistake. Colt laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stable walls. Miss Isabella, I may be just an overseer, but I'm not stupid. These books belong to your boy here, and we all know what that means. He turned to Samuel, his expression turning vicious. You've been getting educated, haven't you, boy? Thinking you're as good as white folks, maybe even thinking you're good enough for white women? Samuel remained silent. But Isabella could see the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. He knew as she was beginning to understand that this was the end of everything. Mr. Colt, Isabella tried one last time, I'm ordering you to let this matter drop. As a member of the Whitmore family— Miss Isabella, Colt interrupted, his voice suddenly cold and formal. I'm afraid this matter is beyond your authority. This is a question of plantation security, and I have a duty to report it to your father. As Colt marched them both toward the main house, Isabella felt her world crumbling around her. In trying to protect their love, she had exposed it to the very people who would destroy it. And as the lights of the plantation house grew brighter ahead of them, she realized that the unimaginable twist in their story was just beginning. The confrontation that awaited them would test not only their love, but their very will to survive in a world that had no place for what they had found together. The study of Colonel Charles Whitmore was a monument to Southern power and tradition. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and maps of the vast plantation holdings. It was here, in this bastion of white supremacy, that the fate of Isabella and Samuel would be decided. Colonel Whitmore sat behind his massive desk, his face a mask of cold fury as he examined the evidence Jeremiah Colt had laid before him. The forbidden books, Samuel's notebook of poetry, and Colt's damning testimony painted a picture that threatened everything the colonel held dear. Explain this to me again, Colt. The the colonel said, his voice dangerously quiet. You found my daughter, and this slave, alone together in the old stable. Yes, sir, Colt replied, barely able to contain his satisfaction. They claimed to be looking for a cat, but when I searched the stable I found these books and this notebook. The boy's been teaching himself to read, and from the looks of these poems he's been harboring inappropriate feelings for Miss Isabella. Isabella stood beside Samuel in front of the desk, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. Samuel remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the floor. But she could see the tension in every line of his body. Is this true, Isabella? Colonel Whitmore asked, his voice cutting through her like a blade. Have you been meeting with this slave? Isabella lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. Father, Samuel has done nothing wrong. He was simply— I asked you a direct question, the colonel interrupted. Have you been meeting with this slave? The weight of the moment pressed down on Isabella like a physical force. She could lie, could try to maintain the fiction that their meetings had been innocent. But looking at Samuel, seeing the resignation in his posture, she realized that lies would only make things worse. Yes, she said quietly, I have been meeting with Samuel. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Colonel Whitmore's face went white, then red, then white again, as the full implications of his daughter's confession sank in. For how long? He asked, his voice barely controlled. Several months. And what was the nature of these meetings? Isabella felt Samuel tense beside her, and she knew that her next words would determine both their fates. She could minimize it, could claim it was merely intellectual curiosity, but as she looked at her father's face, twisted with rage and disgust, she realized that half-truths would not save them. We talked, she said simply, about books, about ideas, about life. About life, the colonel repeated slowly. And did these conversations lead to physical intimacy? The question was like a slap across Isabella's face. She felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. Shame at having to discuss something so private and precious in front of these men, and anger at the assumption that her relationship with Samuel could be reduced to something base and animalistic. Father, Answer the question, Isabella. She looked at Samuel then, seeing the pain in his eyes, the way he seemed to be bracing himself for the blow that was coming. In that moment, she made a decision that surprised even herself. I love him, she said clearly, and he loves me. The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Whitmore stared at his daughter as if she had grown a second head, while Colt's mouth fell open in shock. Even Samuel looked up in surprise, his eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and terror. You love him, the colonel repeated slowly, as if the words were in a foreign language. You love a slave.